Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I cannot support Senate Joint Resolution 19 for at least one simple reason. There are others, of course, because I support the freedom of our fellow citizens to speak and to participate in the political process. Many of America's founders who participated in drafting the Constitution thought that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. Others were more skeptical of government power and insisted that the Constitution explicitly deny Congress the power to do things such as abridge the freedom of speech. And yet here we are. The desire to control and manipulate what our fellow citizens say and do in the political process is so great that the First Amendment has become an obstacle that must be removed rather than a protection that must be respected. Of all the constitutional amendments of this kind proposed over the last 40 years, the original version of this proposal was the most extreme. Not to be outdone, the title of most extreme was then captured by the version adopted by the subcommittee and that we have before us today. This is the first attempt to empower the government to enforce whatever the government deems to be political equality. The government could decide whatever it wants political equality to be, and of course, that judgment could change from year to year, from election to election. If simply suggesting that the government should have the power to enforce political equality is not enough to oppose this amendment, then our liberties are in greater danger than I thought. But this proposal goes even further in this dangerous direction than the measure that it replaced. Past amendments of this kind had a very specific definition of what the government could regulate, such as expressly advocating the election or defeat of a specific candidate. The original version of Senate Joint Resolution 19 broadened the scope of government control to supporting or opposing candidates. The proposal before us today, however, is focused simply on influencing elections. Voter registration drives influence elections. Get out the vote efforts influence elections. Nonpartisan voter information influences election. Discussion of issues influence elections. This proposed amendment, therefore, would not only empower the government to enforce whatever version of political equality it preferred, but it would empower the government to do so by regulating anything that influences an election. Well, not quite. Under this amendment, the freedom of speech would be subject to regulation and control, but the freedom of the press would be left alone. Supporters of this amendment want to manipulate how individual citizens influence elections or how nonprofit groups influence elections, but seem perfectly happy with the way that big media, including some of the largest corporations in America, influence elections. It's hard to imagine anything that more dramatically affects political equality than to clamp down on ordinary Americans' freedom of speech, but to give big media a free pass. No proposal has ever sought both to empower the government to enforce its own vision of political equality and to do so by regulating anything that influences elections. We should eliminate rather than create barriers to participation in the political process. We should encourage rather than discourage activities by our fellow citizens to influence the election of their leaders. We should prohibit rather than empower government to control how Americans participate in the political process. Now, I oppose this amendment because I believe that freedom is not the problem, it is the solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.